47 or 67?
Welcome, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Arnold, and Chris has emphasized that he wants to get right into the program with as little in the way of introductions as possible. So I'm so glad to see all these people here. It's really wonderful. So thank you all for coming. And let's just get right into it. In brief, Cook Inlet is at an energy crossroads. As most all of you know, the Railbelt region is heavily dependent on natural gas, and Hilcorp announced last spring it may not be able to guarantee delivery after current contracts expire, which is a little eyebrow raising. REAP has been concerned that there's been little public discussion of both price and availability, hence the creation of this forum tonight. So we're going to break it up into two panels. The first looking at where we are and the challenges we face if we stick to the status quo, and the second on where we could be and potential solutions. I'm going to ask some opening questions, and we're going to have some conversations up here, and then I'll be asking your questions as they arise, and the way to do that is on this screen above here, those of you who are technologically attuned. There will be a 15-minute break between the two panels, and our first panel, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for agreeing to be here and for giving us your time. Our first panel is Derek Nottingham, who is the current director of DNR's Oil and Gas Division. Mark Foster is a former RCA commissioner and truly an expert on all things energy related in Alaska. And Anthony Scott is currently an analyst with REAP. He's also worked at DNR. He's also a former RCA commissioner. And all of these gentlemen have extensive bios, and I encourage you to read all about them in the program. We won't get too into it because we want to save time for the discussion. So without further ado, I'd really like to just get right into it, and we'll start with Derek. If you could sort of set the stage for us. The state's been pretty accurate in predicting Cook Inlet gas availability and price, a little easier than oil, I would think. Can you first characterize the DNR assessments in 2011 and 2018? And just overall give us a sense of the lay of the land.
Sure. Thank you, Liz. And, I just want to say real quick, just thanks for having us here. And at the Division of Oil and Gas, one of our main priorities, tasks is really to provide good, solid information on things like Cook Inlet gas supply to the public. So I'll be speaking on that tonight as best I can. I'm not an expert, but I'm learning very quickly. And so jumping right into it, as you're all very aware, Cook Inlet is a very mature basin. It's 65 years old now in its production. It's the predominant source of energy for the South Central region. So going back to the late 2000s and early 2010s, there was a issue that was seen that, hey, Cook Inlet gas supply is going to eventually decline, and there could be a potential gas shortage. So several studies were done by the Division of Oil and Gas to over the course of 2009 through 2018, actually, to understand supply and demand, the gas reserves remaining, costs of exploration, production and development, and really to understand when and if there would be a shortfall in gas supply in the Cook Inlet. One of the things about the 2011 and 2018 studies that they really confirmed is that, yes, Cook Inlet is on decline in terms of natural gas and oil. And really, in order for supply to meet demand, you have to augment or enhance the production through additional investment. I think that might be kind of motherhood and apple pie, if I can use that term, but the that is a big kind of aha from those studies. The component parts of those particular studies, the 2011 and 2018, might have differed very slightly in how they were put together. One called the enhancements, so drilling and production optimization. They were called enhancements or something to that effect. The other one called it augmented production. What that really means is you have to invest in the Cook Inlet in order to keep supply levels at the level they need to be to meet demand. One of the things, if you go back and look at those studies, the 2011 study assumed a demand of about 90 BCF per year. Or for folks that don't know what the term BCF is, that's kind of natural gas language for billions of cubic feet. I mean, think of that as the amount of energy. And then the 2018 study, that study assumed a demand of about 80 BCF per year. So a couple of other distinct things about those studies that were kind of commonalities, if you will. The natural gas supply you do see a shortfall relative to demand in both studies. It's consistent. You see it in the early 2020s or late 2020s, somewhere within the 2020 decade. And there is an increasing cost to meet that demand and make up that shortfall. Those are very consistent amongst those studies. The market dynamics from then until now have changed a bit. The Agrium plant is now offline. The Kenai LNG facility is offline. We've gotten much more efficient in use of electricity, so the demand for gas for electricity has decreased over the last 10 to 15 years. So we're no longer at a 90 BCF or 100 BCF, billion cubic feet per year demand level, down to more like 70 billion cubic feet per year. But nevertheless, it's still quite a bit of demand in the inlet. The other thing I want to point out real quick there, Liz, is that we have seen new exploration in the basin over the course of the last decade. I would characterize that as that we've seen some discoveries, we've seen some new production come online, but we haven't seen where we've found that game-changing discovery that puts the inlet in a position where supply is readily available to meet the demand. The other thing that we've seen is an operator like Hilcorp come in and continue to develop in the mature fields and find optimization opportunities to kind of mitigate the decline in the field. So that has been, from a gas supply standpoint, a good thing. However, the thing that remains true today, as it did back when that first study in 2011 was done, is that it's a mature field. It's almost 70 years old. Gas continues to decline, and you still have to make very significant capital investments in order to just kind of keep up with that treadmill of decline to meet demand.
So it costs more to get the gas.
Yes.
What do you see ahead? What do you see 2020, 2030?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've been doing a study over the course of 2022. We call it the 2022 Cook Inlet gas production forecast, and we're probably going to release that to the public in a very short amount of time. I can't show you or say exactly what that study will indicate. What I can tell you is the dynamics that I've just described that we're seeing back in 2011, the 2018 study, those are still at play. The market dynamics, like I mentioned, they have changed, but the the decline is still there. It's still real. Development drilling in the Cook Inlet in these mature fields is probably increasingly difficult, is a way I would say it. And so, yeah, things have changed somewhat, but all those dynamics kind of still are there. And then what does that mean for things like price? I think, the new study that we're going to release won't do a projection on price or what it costs to develop that incremental MTF to meet demand like some of the other studies have. But what I can say about that is those market dynamics, the market pressures are definitely there for prices to increase.
What could change that?
Well, I think, the Cook Inlet does have quite a bit of undiscovered and even some discovered natural gas resources available. So that's one thing that could change that. And, in our remit as the Division of Oil and Gas, our remit is basically to ensure that the state is maximizing those resources. And so one of the things that we see is that if there is a big discovery, if there is, some of those kind of opportunities that get developed, that could change that. Now, a lot of exploration was done in the 20 teens, 20 through, the end of the decade. And like I said, there wasn't that, that big discovery that kind of saved the day. The geologic risk is real, it's present. So the cost pressures are really high on the industry. There's some other factors that really make Cook Inlet very challenging from a exploration and development standpoint. The cost pressure itself could entice folks to come in and want to explore and develop gas in the Cook Inlet. That's a possibility.
Are you at liberty to say where any of these new discoveries might be?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think generally I can say that, just generally, if you think about the Cook Inlet, the east side of the Cook Inlet is very well developed from its infrastructure, its accessibility, and that is where a lot of if you call anything in the Cook Inlet easy in terms of gas, that's where the easy gas has been produced and discovered. The west side of the Cook Inlet and offshore is the harder stuff, and the harder stuff is, kind of that tail end of the curve where it gets more expensive, and that's probably, in my estimation, our general consensus where those discoveries would have to come from.
As a journalist, I learned early on that it's not about what's there, it's about what's economically recoverable, right?
Yes. That is what it's all about is, there's our Division of Geologic and Geophysical Survey, sorry, I can't get our DGGS, they estimated, I believe it's 19 TCF of remaining potential in the Cook Inlet. And for folks that don't know what a TCF is, so if you think of a billion cubic feet, TCF is a trillion cubic feet. The Cook Inlet to date, I believe, has produced about 9 TCF. So there's in the ground, undiscovered, there's 2 or more times the amount of gas that's already produced out of the Cook Inlet. That's what's estimated. So it isn't about is there gas. It's about whether you can develop it economically.
What can we learn from the most recent Cook Inlet lease sales?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this recent one in the winter, so six state leases were picked up, and there was also a federal lease picked up in the federal lease sale, all by Hilcorp. But I think what that speaks to me is that, the industry hasn't given up on the Cook Inlet in terms of developing its gas. The companies like Hilcorp see potential and see the value of going after that gas. Obviously for the right price, for cost of investment and gas prices and whatnot. But companies still see potential there. I think that's reflective in the fact that, yeah, there are 19 TCF still out there, undiscovered, undeveloped.
Should we, or should I as a consumer, should we as a state be alarmed when Hilcorp says we're not sure we're going to be able to fill our obligations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is concerning, but I believe that there are options out there to meet that kind of meet that concern.
What do you make of it? Is it like a kid coming home before report cards are out,
Yeah.
2 months ahead of time and saying, yeah, I might not do so well?
I don't really, I think my impression is that Hilcorp has been very genuine and honest about what they see. And if you think about what they're doing in terms of what they're operating fields that are 65 years old, some of them. And I've worked mature fields in my career, and it gets to a point where it's very difficult. And so I don't think this is, Chicken Little. I think it's a real thing that they're seeing. And I understand why that is. If I don't want to speak too much to their stated philosophy and whatnot, but they are very good at developing and producing mature assets. That's what they're very good at.
And they increasingly need to understand what future demand will be.
But I'm sorry, repeat.
And they increasingly need to understand what future demand will be.
Yeah, that's
practical.
Yeah, that is very true. Operators in the Cook Inlet in general, the whole market actually operates on what that future demand is. The utilities obviously have to have a great understanding of what future demands are going to be. The entities involved in the Cook Inlet have a huge investment and interest in knowing what demand is.
All right, I'm going to take you off the hot seat there for a little bit. Okay. Not that I put you on the hot seat. Really, those are softballs. No, and I want to encourage the three of you to have a discussion among you. You guys are the brains on all this, and not me. So I want you to ask each other questions for sure. I do want to ask Anthony. You were recently quoted as saying that utilities are essentially making energy policy for all of us. Can you expand on that and give us a sense of how you think that's going?
Sure. So the utilities are in position of making decisions about how we generate our power. They take the lead in proposing how the costs of generating and transmitting and distributing that power will be recovered from ratepayers. Who pays how much, that sort of thing. And I can tell you as a commissioner, as a general matter, we don't have a lot of fights over rate design that gets proposed. And as a general matter, we say, okay. as a former commissioner. So until when I say that they make energy policy, the reason why I say that is because it's my view that for the most part, there's not a great deal of public engagement over those questions. Now, why should we even worry? I mean, after all, automakers decide what kind of cars they want to make, and we don't worry about that. People to choose to make certain kinds of ice cream, and we don't worry about that. We don't worry about ice cream policy. So why is this different? The reason why it's different is because electric utilities are monopolies. We don't have a choice. So the sort of choices that consumers could otherwise make, which then drives, in effect, drives in effect policy from a market perspective, can't really happen because the utilities are monopolies, and what they choose to do is what we all end up pretty much living with. So there are a couple of potential, if you want to call them checks or balances, mechanisms for oversight for how those decisions get made. And it's and I'm just speaking as a former commissioner and not even wearing my repat right now. It's my view that those mechanisms don't work necessarily terribly well. There are two of them. One is board governance. Each of these utilities have boards, and the boards at the end of the day are elected by their members. And so it's a sort of, hey, this is a representative democracy kind of thing. But as a general matter, at most 10% of the people who consume electricity vote in those elections for board members. And I've recently gotten a little bit interested in how business gets done, and I've started going to meetings, and it turns out that an awful lot of the important information that as a member you might need to understand whether somebody's making good decisions, you can't get access to because decisions are being made in executive session. So if decisions are being made in executive session, you can't actually see any of the information that in terms of a governance structure, I don't think it necessarily works terribly well. And that even presumes that you have enough critical mass of members who are educated enough and know the material enough that they could even weigh in. This stuff is complicated. So the other obvious avenue to look to is the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, which does regulate the conduct of all of these utilities. Which is fairly unusual. Again, as a former commissioner, the commission has never had until very, very recently what's called siting authority, which is the ability to say when a utility decides to build something, and generally they don't have to engage in a mother may I exercise. They just build stuff. And then after the fact, the commission is in a position of saying, you shouldn't have done that, or it was basically okay. The problem as a commissioner is you're not really in a very good position to say, actually, you shouldn't have done that, and you can't recover your costs for what you've done in rates. Why not? Because we're co-ops. So at the end of the day, the members are going to pay the bills no matter what. And so once the costs are incurred, the members are going to pay for them. And so if you don't have to come up in advance to ask for permission for what gets built, you've got a problem. The other problem about the commission oversight of all of that is that, quite frankly, the commission does not have, in my view, the necessary expertise to really weigh in. But it is the forum where it should happen. But historically, it never really has. The commission hasn't had the statutory authority to exercise any jurisdiction over it. So, at least in my view, what you really have in effect are utility management with the assent of their boards, making decisions that affect all of us. And because they're monopoly firms, we can't take our dollars elsewhere. And so it's for that reason that I believe that all of this whole process of what our energy mix looks like going forward, and who should pay for what and how, really deserves to be opened up and made more democratic, with a lot more oversight. And I think that would help ensure that better decisions get made. So.
I know this panel isn't supposed to be the solutions panel. It's supposed to be lay out the problem or lay out the status quo, but how do we even begin to get where you're talking about going? I mean, it's obviously a legislative solution.
Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about the Cook Inlet gas or situation.
No, actually, I was talking about the regulatory,
Yeah.
limited regulatory power.
Right. Well, one of the things that I worked on when I was a commissioner, and we did manage to get it through the legislatures, we did get the RCA siting authority for new generation and new transmission, which is good. It hasn't been exercised yet. I guess I want to pitch something to my good friend Mark about the Dixon Diversion Project, which is an example of where siting authority is not actually being exercised because the commission doesn't actually have jurisdiction, even though the legislature intended to give the commission that jurisdiction.
Let's talk about Bradley Lake.
Sure. Bradley Lake was funded partially by ratepayers and partially by grants from the state, and it was commissioned in 1993. As part of the process of funding and putting together that package, the utilities advocated for deregulating Bradley Lake and the power sales contracts associated with that. So the legislature gave a grant of deregulation for that power sales agreement. The committee that's been meeting on that for 30 years almost has enjoyed that deregulated environment. They have recently decided they want to extend that environment and build some additional facilities adjacent to the Bradley Lake Basin and some transmission facilities. Under that, basically what I consider to be a stale grant of an unregulated monopoly to that power sales region. And the evidence for that not working, in my mind, is the hydro project that's recently been put forward in a conceptual study in June of 2023, that is the Dixon diversion. And when I go through the engineering in tables 1 and tables 2 and match up the costs and the output and run the finances, it's approaching 40 cents a kilowatt hour for that power. And I go, that doesn't make sense to me. As someone who's been a CFO and an audit committee member on boards for power companies, it's just way outside the bounds, because we're currently paying for natural gas power on the order of 6, 7, maybe 8 cents. So 40 is way outside the bounds. So there's not an obvious, strong public rationale for paying a huge premium for that hydro resource. So I think it merits consideration of removing that exemption and having the commission take an independent look at that project and other projects that come up, so we can really get to what I think of as a sort of a level playing field, an independent group that's designed to review rates and investments and see which ones make the most sense for the ratepayers. And particularly when you have a system where you have several different interests, I think the commission is in a position to do that kind of work. And I think it's timely for them to take that on.
Okay, let's backtrack a little bit. I wanted to ask you about the director's assessment and discussion of the assessment of possible future Cook Inlet gas availability in the next decade. Do you have a view of price and availability?
Yes, and basically following the price and availability dating back to the time on the audit committee and the MLNP board when we were looking at the shortages 2009, 2010, 2011, and essentially negotiating with Agrium and the LNG export and going, we need to have as much gas supply as we can locally. We need to put in storage and really trying to understand the market dynamics. So taking a look at the 2018 study, and I do want to thank the state again and the Division of Oil and Gas for updating that work because that's very valuable to understand essentially how the costs increase as we get through more and more difficult fields. And essentially we've gone through the easy stuff and now it's getting harder and the costs are escalating. So if you take that model from the 2018, add on to that we have less and less competition among the firms as the market consolidates, which means you have higher price margin, and then extend that out, pretty soon you get to prices in the order of $12, $13, $14 per MCF. And the reason that's of interest is that's getting high enough that you start to think about, do I want to import LNG because it might be competitively priced with that supply? And so that's the interesting dynamic. And in my view, as the Energy Authority has found in prior studies, there's a point at which you really do start to import LNG because that becomes the competitive supply that's available to you. And I'd say somewhere in that, basically that $14 range is where we're looking at importing LNG and from the Pacific Rim. And so I think that's the outlook. And what's interesting about that is as you get up that high, now suddenly many renewable alternatives become very competitive. And that's why this is a really interesting conversation about as the gas supply goes down and the price goes up, when do we reach that point where renewables become very competitive? And I think we're in that range as we look at LNG imports in the 2028, 2030 range as a distinct possibility.
What do the rest of you think about that? I mean, importing LNG is really expensive. I mean, it's just, to me, it's it's crazy.
It's a Coles to Newcastle kind of thing. It always feels like, right? On the other hand, I agree with Mark. I think it's at the end of the day, all but inevitable that we'll get there. The question is exactly when. I want to again underscore how good the work that DNR has done over the years. And it's a little bit of a cheat. I was at Division of Oil and Gas at the time of the 2011 study and helped frame what the question should be. If you look at that study and then you look at the 18 study and you look at the Hilcorp announcement, they really all do in fact line up. They tell a consistent story. The gas is getting harder and harder and more expensive to develop. It's there, but it's more expensive to develop. And we are seeing it play out in real time. If you look at gas prices from the late aughts to the mid-teens, prices went up a lot. We were very fortunate that Hilcorp came into the basin because they were kind of a Goldilocks company is how I think about it. They are very good at developing mature resources. They were big enough that they had the financial wherewithal to go out and do the things that needed to be done to develop the resources to keep the heat and lights on. they replaced much bigger companies who had previously had those lease positions, companies like Chevron and Exxon and Shell and like that, Conoco. Those companies were actually too big for the Cook Inlet market. So the prizes that remained available are pretty small, and we're not a big market. So there was no big payoff for those companies. So attracting capital from headquarters to drill, to go after these small targets was hard to do. And it's not about how much money you can make on an internal rate of return basis. Those companies are so big that they care about how much total value you can aggregate to the company. And internal rate of return on 10 cents, it could be 1,000%, but who cares? If you're ConocoPhillips, you just don't care. You don't want to spend your people's expertise on those targets. So we got lucky that we had we had a company that was big enough that had the financial wherewithal to go after what's there. But they were small enough for it to be attractive. And I think we are very likely to continue to see prices rise consistent with the previous work that has been done. And there's a slide outside in the lobby. You should take a look at it from the 18 study. I think it has real prices for natural gas, 2016 prices at like $13.50, which in today's dollars is, I don't know, I'm going to make it up. It's over 15. I think we're to continue to attract development beyond the 2030 range. I agree with Mark. I think that's what we're looking at. And I don't think it is likely that we're going to have anybody coming in to save us with big discoveries. Because again, the risk for going after something big is big. And our market is small. And so the payout is necessarily not going to be very large. So I think we just are where we are. We may not like it, but prices are going to rise. And at some point we're going to be importing LNG, either because it's less expensive or because it's the only way to keep our houses warm during the winter.
But it's tradition here in Alaska. This is what we do, right? We subsidize for guys to come in and make big discoveries. Isn't that our trajectory? Well, how do we get off that?
Well, we have done that. The last time, in the late aughts, early, I forget when the Cook Inlet Recovery Act was passed. I don't remember, but it was like 2011 or something like that. Anyway, the state threw big subsidies at development. I haven't done a formal study. My view, anyway, is that it's very unlikely that that resulted in a lot of hydrocarbons being developed. The reason why is because most of the leases in Cook Inlet, frankly, are held by Hilcorp. And Hilcorp, again, has been, in my view, a really good corporate citizen in letting everybody signing contracts that give everybody line of sight to plan in terms of their supply. And then two, being able to say, we're not sure we're going to be able to meet all of your needs going forward, so that we all have some time to plan and do something about it. I don't think subsidies make a whole lot of sense because, again, in terms of this company sizing thing that we talked about, Hilcorp is already the dominant player. I forget their leasehold position, but I want to say it's like 75%, something like that.
I have 80.
Okay. So it's pretty dominant. It's 80%. I lowballed it. Hilcorp is in a position already to charge what they need in the market. They are the dominant player. It's not like people can undercut them and then they can't recover enough. So, I mean, they'll take our subsidies, but the likelihood that it produces a whole bunch of new gas, I think, is, in my view, small. But again, I hope I'm not speaking out of school. But anyway, that's my view of it.
Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
I think there's also a sense among members of the legislature who have served for decades that they have put a substantial amount of subsidy into the Cook Inlet. And they don't perceive that they've gotten good return on that investment. So going forward, I think the level of skepticism may be higher than it has been previously.
Well, what do you think it's going to take to diversify the energy mix?
I think on its face, the outlook for the prices have to get validated in the sort of the next few contract cycles as the utilities negotiate for their next contract and begin those negotiations and really try and explore what is the market price that might be out there depending on the commitment they make. I think that will be a factor in their consideration of how fast and how far do they need to go to prepare for alternatives. I think in those time horizons, in order to effectively negotiate for the natural gas, you need to have credible alternatives. In order to have a credible alternative to the natural gas, i.e. a hydro project instead of another increment of natural gas, or something, as an alternative, geothermal. You need to develop those on long time cycles. They don't happen overnight. So now is the time to begin to screen your options and start moving the ones that look favorable forward so that you have credible options if that price for natural gas gets to that LNG import price that really begins to go, that's high enough. I really need to look for hydro, geothermal, wind combinations to get out from under that high price of natural gas.
So I have I think complementary but different view a little bit. I think if we wait for this to get cashed out in terms of negotiations around gas prices, we probably waited too long.
I concur, but
Okay.
with respect to the project development, you got to get the project development started.
Yeah.
In order for it to be credible in the negotiation, so that when you're exploring the price in the negotiation, you really do have a walk away. Without that, the suppliers got you.
Well, and I mean, when we talk about alternatives, I would like to bring in like home heating. So most of us who are fortunate enough to heat our homes with natural gas, we don't really have alternative right now that makes much economic sense. Heating with electricity is so much worse. Propane, also much worse. We also have a tremendous amount of infrastructure which is sunk around how we all heat our homes. So anyway, my own view is that it's incumbent on us to conserve our local gas resources now as much as we possibly can, because they're relatively cheap for home heating. And that means, at least in my view, we need to pivot to gas alternatives for making electricity. And those are renewable resources, whether they're hydro or geothermal, which are great resources because they're base loadable, potentially, certainly dispatchable, so on. They are very long term. There's a certain amount, certainly on the geothermal, there's a fair amount of risk in terms of proving that stuff up. So that is, again, long lead time. So anyway, my view is you need policy, and that means you really need legislation. I think we need to open up the conversation and bring it into the true policymaking arena rather than just leaving decisions up to individual managers of utilities. I think we need to have a broader discussion about what kind of energy future we want. And again, I've shared my own view, and it could well be wrong, but my own view is it makes sense to conserve gas, local gas, for heating as much as we can and move aggressively to alternatives that don't consume gas for electricity and do it right now, like aggressively, as well as putting down markers for longer term plays, be it hydro or geothermal.
What do you think the biggest political hurdle to a unified rail belt renewable portfolio is?
Sure. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is the biggest hurdle. I think the operators within the utilities view the integration of, let's call it 50% wind into their system as something that they view with uncertainty. How will that work? So they're hesitant to want to embrace that and sort of walk down that path. And they have a lot of considerations for how would I integrate that? They're putting in place batteries, they're building up transmission capacity in anticipation of that and for other sort of stability reasons across the rail belt, and really to help them with the hydro that they already have in there to make it balance out. So I think uncertainty in the end is probably the single biggest factor, and that's the nut that I think we can start to address by working through sort of how can we get there, rather than sort of pausing and wondering whether. It's much more interesting to me to go, let's put a marker out for how we get off of natural gas reliance, because it's not just going as a higher price, but it's likely to be volatile as it is in other markets around the world. And that volatility hurts people in the ratepayer pocket, whether they're heating or whether they're buying electricity. And so if you convert over to a renewable portfolio, you're reducing significantly your exposure to that volatility, which is very helpful for consumers. So I think it's those things I think should be helping to drive the utilities to join with people who are advocating for renewables to at least begin the exploration and reduce the uncertainty over how that can work.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Mark said. I think another take on your characterization of uncertainty is comfort with doing things in a certain way, right? If you're an operator and you've spent your full career doing your operations a certain way, and you've been able to rely very substantially on these really great dispatchable resources. And we had a long period in Cook Inlet where natural gas was really cheap. I mean, we pay substantially more than the average electric utility for natural gas in the lower 48 in America. But that wasn't the case always. In fact, we used to pay much less for natural gas up here because we had surplus. So we've got a whole culture and standard set of operating procedures around doing things a certain way, and I wouldn't want to change either. I mean, I'm used to doing things the way I like to do it, and these other ways of doing things are going to be harder and riskier and involve learning and failure and learning and failure and success. And like, why do it the hard way and have people get mad at you potentially when you can keep doing it the easy way? So anyway.
And these utilities have debt loads, right, carried on their fossil fuel projects.
They do. The stuff that's been built is going to continue to get paid for by ratepayers over its depreciable life. And at least my view is the thermal plants that have been built, especially the more recent ones, we're going to need even in a renewable heavy future. They're going to be useful and needed. And so that's okay. They're just may not run quite as much as historically, as they are today. But yeah, we do need to continue to all pay for it. There's no way around that.
Derek, I don't mean to be ignoring you here. Do you have anything you want to add to any of this?
You're a major in economics, right? I think my just thoughts on it is I believe in the market to a large degree, and I think the market will drive a lot of the individual kind of projects that will actually come in and help us kind of meet our energy demands here, whether that's renewables, whether that's natural gas projects, whatever that may be, whether that is importing LNG. I believe that the market will ultimately work here.
Without really incentivizing renewables or.
I think it can work, yes.
Mhm.
I think it's useful to keep in mind that between the Infrastructure Act with its federal subsidies for transmission systems and the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a considerable support for renewable energy in investment tax credits and production tax credits, I think there's a lot of federal support that can be leveraged to reduce the uncertainty around integration costs. And in fact, I think you'll find that the level of federal subsidy is more than sufficient to pay for a lot of the uncertainty that people are thinking about right now and really get you to a point where renewables truly are competitive with the price horizons we're looking at for natural gas.
Yeah, I think there's no question in my mind that prices provide incredibly important information, and people respond to prices. My comments at the beginning, though, mentioned that the folks that are responding to prices are not end-use consumers, right? The people making decisions about what our electricity portfolio looks like from a generation perspective, they're not the end-use consumers. I think they're absolutely well-meaning. I think there's no question that they, from their perspective, are trying to do the best by their members. But there are reasons for thinking that, which I tried to allude to before, that the connection between what final consumers may ultimately want and decisions that get made that then determine what consumers ultimately get, those connections are not nearly as tight because we do not have competitive markets. We have monopolies. And that it's not a bad thing that we have monopolies. It's inescapable that to some degree that we have monopolies because there are increasing returns to scale for a lot of the portions of the energy sector. But again, if we were talking about ice cream, there'd be nothing to worry about here because it's a competitive market. But it's hard to get really robust competition in the electricity sector. You can do it in certain ways, but I think we haven't had that to date up here.
Yeah, allow me to reinforce this point in maybe a slightly different way. I do think the Regulatory Commission, acting as an independent review and regulator, really can help nudge the utilities toward competitive alternatives on generation and transmission options. And I think it's easy for the utilities, if they are unregulated, as they are at Bradley Lake, or lightly regulated, as they are most of the time, with lots of simplified rate filing and lots of mechanisms to take care of variability. So their exposures really are lower typically than investor-owned utilities in the lower 48. So it's a pretty light regulation. They don't have as much sort of independent nudging toward what is the portfolio of options that you have available that might work best for the system. And I think they're anchored up on Bradley Lake because they've been working it for 30 years. And I think they could stand a nudge to get them out of that space to really look at some other options. And we need to get started on it yesterday because of where we're at in Cook Inlet supply and where those prices are headed. And so I think it's timely to get rolling forward with the independent regulation and with pressing forward on why do we want a renewable portfolio standard. I think the argument in my mind is because it's actually likely to be significantly less expensive than holding on to the natural gas portfolio. Not just less expensive, but less volatile, and so more valuable to the customers. So I think for those reasons, it's time to get moving forward.
So who provides that nudge?
The legislature gets to decide sort of how fast and how far. And that's pretty traditional across the U.S. State regulation really has been that space. In Alaska is somewhat different because we are not interconnected with other states, so we don't have the federal regulatory connection. So it really is the state regulators here who are the ones who are driving a lot of that if they choose to engage.
Are you at all optimistic about this happening in the current legislature?
I think given some of the votes on the regulatory authority on siting, I view that as a positive development. And many of the legislators involved in that discussion are back in the mix. So I think there's some interest there. And I'll look forward to seeing to what extent, as the House comes together, how that stacks up. It's hard for me to read it right now. And then I'll be intrigued to see how the governor's team responds to that and sort of susses that out. But I do think there are significant public benefits that the policymakers will be able to sort of understand when you look at what options do we have, what options could we develop, and are we really giving full play to the wide range of interests and stakeholders, some of whom are going to come on the next panel, so that they can advance their projects. The competition among renewable resources is a great place to generate value for the ratepayers and for the companies. And I think the sooner we get after, I think the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I think the key thing, again, that I want to stress about where I think we should go, which was not your question, but reinforcing what Mark said is we are right now extremely heavily dependent on natural gas. You said it at the beginning, it is the case in terms of an investment portfolio. Generally, it wouldn't be wise to put over 80% of your dollars on a single investment. We could be wrong or not wrong. We could all be happily surprised, and there might be some great big natural gas discovery that nobody really expects, and we're in gas surplus again. And isn't it great that we have all this natural gas generation? That could happen. But again, from a portfolio perspective, it makes sense to put eggs in different baskets. And so, I've predicted future prices before, and I've always been really wrong. It's true. But we do know that portfolio perspective reduces risk. Having a broader portfolio. And I think the hard thing is to change what we're doing right now. And I think it's going to require legislative nudge. I think what are prospects for that? I don't know. It's got to be harder than projecting prices, right? But I think there's definitely an opening. I think there's recognition that what happened at the federal level means that, roughly speaking, the federal government's going to pay about 30% of the capital costs of any renewable project we do. And we've got about 10 years, I think, to take advantage of those opportunities. So that's cool. Meanwhile, odds are natural gas prices are going up in Cook Inlet. So it just makes sense to act now while we've got this closing window. At least as I see it, it's a closing window. If nothing else, we will preserve cheap Cook Inlet natural gas for heating. And that would be, in my view, a very good thing, because there are not a lot of good alternatives for that.
That 30% was extended, right? So that's the next 10 years, is that?
Yeah, that's right. Those go through at least 2032, and then they begin to ramp down as carbon goals are increasingly met, as I understand, nationally.
Now, I know we want to get to audience questions at some point. You're going to tell me when to do that. Okay. Just remind everybody that's how you do it. I have a self-indulgent question. Forgive me, Chris. So as part of the whole renewables push, don't we need to more efficiently connect the whole rail belt with the robust power line grid to sort of move the cheapest power to consumers and efficiently move renewables? And this is the journalist asking the obvious question, but I always sort of wonder about this. Don't we need that?
The short answer is yes, depending on where the renewables that you find and are going to develop that are the least cost are located. It's not inconceivable that you in fact have clusters of them that would support demand clusters so that you wouldn't need a lot of interconnection. It's also certainly possible that you would need additional transmission upgrades to enable the renewables to be sort of more broadly shared reliably across the network. And you see that if you look at the evolution of the Texas market and other markets in the United States, where siting for transmission facilities is very challenging. So you really do see bottlenecks occurring and renewable sort of portfolios running up against some of that and not getting as developed as fast as they could. So there's certainly a distinct possibility that you want additional capacity depending on which sort of resource clusters, geothermal offshore wind or hydro next to a wind, sort of where they're at on the rail belt.
No, I agree with that. What I understood you to say, Mark, is yeah, we're going to need more transmission. And yes, and transmission is hard to site and it's expensive. So we need to be deliberate about what gets built and where. And I think you don't just build it out willy-nilly. You build it out with an eye towards bringing the resources online that you need to. So I don't want to, yeah.
Going back to where we sort of started, which is the current situation in Cook Inlet, what do you guys think about the most recent lease sales? What do you take from that?
I think it's very interesting that only Hilcorp bid. Hilcorp is a particular kind of company. And I think, I want to say, I think Hilcorp's great. And I think they've been a great citizen. I think there's been an important shift that we had from the prior lessees in Cook Inlet who weren't making lots of incremental investment to when Hilcorp came in. And I think, the Hilcorp telling everybody ahead of time, hey, here's the deal. We don't have line of sight for new hydrocarbons when it's time to renew contracts in the same way that we previously have. They've done us all a service, in my view. So I would note that what they haven't said is there's no way we're going to be able to meet anybody's demand. They haven't said that. What they've said is we don't have line of sight. And so in essence, they're suggesting, and my interpretation is it's prudent for us to diversify so that we're not overly reliant on them to meet all of our supply needs. Yeah, I just think the likelihood that in terms of the lease sales, to me anyway, it speaks to the likelihood that some small player is going to come in and make a super giant find and then we're in gas surplus is it's not supported by the evidence. That's what the lease sales tell me. We don't have people clamoring to get land and go after this future big prize. That's how I see it. And I don't want to put Derek on the spot, but if he sees it differently, you should say.
The only thing I'd say is Hilcorp, in my view, doesn't spend money unless they see the opportunity to make money. And so they see opportunity in the leases they picked up. And it, while they only tend to develop in their existing fields, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them actually doing some exploration in the leases that they've picked up. Now, yeah, you're right. Like those recent lease sales are probably not going to make a material impact on the equation in the Cook Inlet. That's very true. And the likelihood of a company coming in and finding an elephant-size gas field is low. I will definitely agree with that. And the evidence of drilling and exploring from 2010 to late in the 2010s does bear that out. But it does happen. And there have been many mature basins that have turned around because of those kind of revitalization efforts. So I'm not purporting to have a crystal ball on that.
I agree with you, and I would say what's happened on the North Slope with oil is a good example of that. We're seeing basically a renaissance over the last 8 years or something, where you had smaller players coming in with different approaches. The difference is they're going after big prizes, and oil's much more valuable than natural gas, and you can always sell as much as you find and can develop. With Cook Inlet, we've got a restricted market. So you could find a supergiant field. That's not necessarily a good news story because the market will only suck up so much. But yes, I absolutely agree. Surprises happen in the industry all the time. It does happen. But counting on that or just hoping for that strikes me as not good energy planning.
Okay, questions from the audience. The Alaska Gasoline Development Corporation claims they can deliver 4 MCF gas to Nikiski by 2032. What's the likelihood of that? Anybody want to?
I think it's low. When I look at Standard & Poor's Global, when I look at Rystad, when I look at WoodMac and look at their supply for natural gas around the world and around the Pacific Rim, the Alaska North Slope natural gas pipeline from the North Slope to Nikiski with the goal of finding a competitive market on the Pacific Rim, I think remains a low probability shot based on equity investors reviewing that possibility and looking at other competitive projects. It's still relatively low probability.
I would agree with that. I need to say I worked on various incarnations of a large diameter gas line project from the North Slope for 11 years. And Stranded Gas Development Act, AGEA, AKLNG. So maybe I'm just jaded, but I've come to appreciate it's an incredibly expensive project, and because of that, it's incredibly difficult to get liftoff. Everything has to come together at the right time, just so. I could talk for a really long time about about all of the whys that I think the probability is low, but I think the probability is low.
We'll leave it at that. What about subsidizing renewable energy for projects that generate power for the Railbelt? I can only imagine your answer to that.
You have a pretty good stack of federal subsidies, so I would hesitate to add state subsidies to that stack unless there was some other sort of aspect of it that made it a compelling case. And I'll offer up one hypothetical, or actually not a hypothetical, one example where I think you can make a reasonable argument for geothermal exploration is an area where it's typically high risk and it has not been subsidized at nearly the same level that oil and gas has been subsidized at for a long time. So you could say, based on the extensive geothermal resource that we believe we have in Alaska relative to other places, and the long history of subsidizing oil and gas, that you could put up some money for the express purpose of reducing the risk of geothermal. And I think there's a credible case to be made for that, specific to Alaska, that's sort of beyond the national renewable subsidies that are available in the act.
Once again, I agree.
That. What is the potential for ratepayer disruption via distributed energy resources? This is for Anthony. At what point can solutions like on-site storage change the rules of the utility game?
I'm not totally sure what the question is getting at. So distributed energy resources are things like rooftop solar, especially when combined with battery storage on site. I think there's potentially tremendous potential there. We've done at REAP a little bit of work looking at the kind of dent that rooftop solar could make and the overall energy mix. And it's substantial. And in Anchorage, this would be a big number, but I mean, it would be a huge number. But if 25% of residents installed who had favorable roofs for it and installed rooftop solar, it would cut residential demand needs by about 10%. There are complications for going that route in terms of regulating all that power and so on, but they're certainly solvable and really exciting opportunities for managing those kinds of resources with modern communications. Mark, do you want to address any of that?
Once upon a time in one of my prior CFO engagements, I took a look at putting in solar on all of the high schools in town. And it wasn't in the pay zone at that point in time, but with falling solar prices for the panels and the ongoing replacement of roofs as part of the sort of maintenance cycle on the facilities, I think that's something that deserves a fresh look and would create some of those distributed resources at a scale where you can get the price down and make it pretty competitive.
That's interesting.
Well, one of the
like sledding hills. Every school, sledding hill, and rooftop solar.
there you go. Well, I mean, one of the things that we've looked at REAP, and I mean, it's just the case is that the economics for things like rooftop solar actually get really favorable if you combine both the current federal subsidies, which are 30% of the capital costs, with favorable financing. And Chris maybe will talk about that in the next panel. But one of the things REAP has been promoting for a while is green bank legislation, where the state would help set up and sponsor a bank to make loans to folks who didn't necessarily have the cash up front to pay for the full cost. And it makes a huge difference in terms of the overall economics, having the reasonably favorable financing available.
I want to wrap this up, but I think we're running out of time. But if any of you gentlemen want to have a last say, please go for it.
Thank you for the opportunity and your patience.
It's been fun. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
Pithy.